Imagine spending decades of your life working humbly, dedicating yourself to making the world around you a better place. Then, one day, an arrogant newcomer with a chip on his shoulder targets you. He disrespects you publicly, believing his position grants him the right to humiliate you. But what if that person, who has endured such disrespect for so long, finds the courage to fight back? This is the story of Mary, a black janitor at Westwood School, who has silently served the institution for over 30 years, earning the love and respect of generations of students. But what happens when she encounters Richard Calloway, a history teacher who embodies the worst kind of prejudice and arrogance? Mary had always been a constant in the halls of Westwood School. For over 3 decades, she had quietly walked the same corridors, cleaning classrooms, bathrooms, and hallways with a steady rhythm that had become as familiar as the sound of the school bell. Her small frame, dark skin, and soft, age-worn features didn't command attention in the conventional way, but the respect she garnered was undeniable. Mary wasn't just another janitor. She was the heart of Westwood, the guardian of its spirit. She had seen countless students pass through the school some bright-eyed and eager, others full of uncertainty. She'd watched them grow up to be doctors, lawyers, and teachers, and in a way, she felt like their mother. Her job had been simple, maintaining the cleanliness of the school. But for Mary, it had always been more than that. It was about the smiles she offered every student she passed in the hallway, the brief words of encouragement she gave to those struggling, and the quiet, invisible strength that seemed to hold the school together in ways no one ever noticed. Her life wasn't extraordinary. It wasn't filled with grand achievements or accolades. But to the students and staff of Westwood, Mary was a symbol of something much greater: kindness, humility, and resilience. Her routine never wavered. Every day, she arrived before sunrise, meticulously cleaning each classroom so the students would arrive to a pristine school. Her years of service had earned her an unwavering respect, not for the title she carried, but for the person she was. She never needed recognition. For Mary, the value lay in the simple act of caring for others. Yet, as time went on, Mary began to notice changes at Westwood. The faces of students were becoming more distracted, the teachers more hurried. A quiet unease settled over the school, one that Mary couldn't quite put her finger on. The school was still the same: its old brick walls, its yellowing posters, the smell of chalk dust in the classrooms. But something was different. It was then that Richard Calloway arrived. Richard Calloway was everything Mary was not. He was loud, imposing, and carried himself with an air of superiority that could be felt as soon as he entered the room. He wore expensive suits. His hair was always perfectly combed, and his every gesture seemed calculated to make others notice him. At 45, he was a man who had achieved success in his career, but it was a success built on arrogance, not respect. Richard came to Westwood with a sharp, intellectual air about him. He was a history teacher, hired to fill the spot vacated by a longtime faculty member who had retired. His credentials were impeccable, his experience extensive, but there was something about him that rubbed people the wrong way from the moment he set foot in the school. Mary was no exception. She noticed it immediately. There was something in the way Richard carried himself that felt wrong, something that seemed to put him above others, even those who had dedicated their lives to the school like Mary. At first, it was subtle. Richard would make comments under his breath, remarks about the state of the school, about how outdated some of the facilities were. He would talk about the students, dismissing them as unprepared or lacking the intellectual rigor that a school like Westwood deserved. But it wasn't until one morning, when he saw Mary cleaning near his classroom, that his true feelings became apparent. As Mary quietly pushed her cleaning cart down the hall, she was startled when Richard stopped in front of her. He gave her a condescending look from head to toe before speaking in a cold tone. "Who are you to be working right in front of my classroom?" he asked, his voice dripping with disdain. Mary looked up at him, offering her usual gentle smile. "Hello, sir. I'm Mary, the janitor for this hallway. I'll finish quickly so it doesn't interfere with your class." Richard smirked, clearly unimpressed. "Oh, so you're the janitor? I thought this school would hire people more carefully," he said, his tone cutting through the quiet hallway like a knife. The words stung, but Mary didn't let them show. She simply nodded and returned to her work, her mind already shifting back to the task at hand. It wasn't the first time someone had treated her with disrespect. Such things had happened throughout her life, but something about Richard's attitude felt different. It felt more personal, more venomous. As the days passed, Richard's disdain for Mary became more obvious. It wasn't just the occasional offhand comment anymore. It was more systematic. In every meeting, every conversation, there was a thinly veiled contempt for Mary's position, her race, and even her very existence at the school. It wasn't just that he didn't care for her. It was that he felt entitled to belittle her in front of others, to assert his perceived superiority over her at every turn. At one faculty meeting, he made a remark that left everyone in the room uncomfortable. "It seems the standards at Westwood have seriously dropped," he said, eyes scanning the room. "If janitors are treated the same as teachers, maybe the school should reconsider this." The words fell like lead, their heaviness settling over everyone present. Richard had made his intentions clear. He wasn't just here to teach history, he was here to establish his dominance. The comment, while seemingly innocuous, was a direct attack on Mary. His words hung in the air, and Mary could feel the eyes of the room shift uncomfortably toward her. But she didn't flinch. She didn't let them see how much it hurt. She simply smiled, her face as calm as ever, though inside, something was beginning to stir. It wasn't long before Richard's behavior took an even darker turn. His comments became more frequent, his actions more direct. He started to target the students who spoke to Mary, questioning their motives, making them feel guilty for acknowledging her presence. Richard's words and actions were like seeds of poison being planted in the minds of the students, and the effects were far-reaching. But it wasn't until Richard humiliated a student named Daniel that everything changed for Mary. Daniel was a bright, hard-working student, a black student who had always been respectful and diligent in his studies. He had a passion for history and was always eager to participate in class. But after several encounters with Richard, Daniel began to change. He became more withdrawn, less confident. His grades began to slip, and his once eager participation in class turned into a quiet resignation. Daniel, the student who once stood proudly in front of the class, now hesitated to answer questions, his voice shaky, his confidence shattered. One day, during a history lesson, Richard asked Daniel a question about World War I, one that Daniel should have been able to answer easily. But when Daniel froze, the room went silent. Richard, sensing an opportunity to assert his authority, mocked Daniel in front of the class. "Well, I'm not surprised," Richard said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "A kid like you, good at sports, but hopeless when it comes to academics." The words cut deep, and Daniel's face flushed with embarrassment. A few students laughed awkwardly, but most just stared at the floor, unsure of how to react. Daniel, who had always been a quiet achiever, felt humiliated. His hands trembled, and his voice failed him as he tried to respond. Richard, sensing his victory, simply turned back to the board, leaving Daniel standing there, exposed and vulnerable. It was in that moment that Mary knew she could no longer stay silent. Mary had spent her life enduring adversity with quiet grace, but there was something different about this situation. Richard's cruelty had reached its peak, and she could no longer simply stand by and watch. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the students, especially Daniel, who had become the victim of Richard's toxic words. Mary knew that if she didn't act, the environment at Westwood would only become more toxic, and it would hurt generations of students to come. The decision to confront Richard Calloway was not an easy one. Mary had spent most of her life working behind the scenes, quietly contributing to the well-being of the school without ever seeking attention or recognition. But now, she had to step into the light. She had to make her voice heard, not just for herself, But for all the students who were being harmed by Richard's racism, the first step was to gather evidence. Mary knew she couldn't take on Richard without undeniable proof of his misconduct. So, with the small phone her daughter had given her, Mary began recording Richard's racist comments. She started by listening closely to his conversations with other teachers, capturing his demeaning remarks about her and other staff members. His words were carefully chosen, subtle in some instances, but always carrying the same underlying message. He believed people like Mary had no place at a school like Westwood. She knew that without this evidence, she would have no real power to bring him down. But the recordings were just the beginning. Mary quietly began talking to other teachers, those who, like her, had seen Richard's true nature. She knew they were scared of him. Richard had built a reputation as a powerful man who could make or break careers. But Mary's calm persistence began to change their minds. One by one, teachers started coming forward, offering their own accounts of Richard's prejudice and discriminatory actions. They, too, had witnessed his racism firsthand, but had been too intimidated to speak up. Daniel was one of the first students to reach out to Mary, seeking her comfort after the humiliation he had endured in Richard's class. His confidence was shattered, and he no longer wanted to speak in class. But when he shared his painful experience with Mary, she knew this was her moment. This wasn't just about a teacher's bias or a student's humiliation, it was about standing up for what was right. Mary's resolve grew stronger each day. She knew that this was no longer a personal battle. It was a fight for the very soul of Westwood. The values the school had once stood for, respect, dignity, and love, were being destroyed by Richard's poisonous influence. And Mary had made up her mind. She would no longer be silent. The confrontation with Richard was inevitable, and it came sooner than anyone expected. One morning, as Mary made her way down the familiar hallway, she could feel the weight of the moment hanging over her. She had gathered all the evidence she needed, and now it was time to confront Richard once and for all. The school had already started to feel the impact of his toxic behavior, but no one had the courage to stand up to him until Mary decided to take action. The first step was to bring her evidence to the administration. Mary requested an emergency meeting with the school's principal, Mr. Peterson. It wasn't long before the entire administration was aware of the recordings she had gathered, the testimonies from the teachers who had witnessed Richard's racism, and Daniel's heartbreaking account of his humiliation in Richard's class. The meeting was scheduled for the following day, and the atmosphere was tense. Richard, as usual, walked into the room with his usual arrogance, not at all anticipating the storm that was about to unfold. He sat at the table, eyes scanning the room, his smirk still in place. He believed he was untouchable, that his status as a teacher would shield him from any consequences. The moment the meeting began, Richard's confidence was evident. When Principal Peterson turned to him and asked, "Mr. Calloway, we have received several reports about your inappropriate behavior and remarks during class. Do you have anything you would like to say before we proceed?" Richard replied, feigning surprise, his voice dripping with insincerity. "I'm sorry for any misunderstandings. I always work with the utmost responsibility and have never intended to offend anyone," he said, his words calculated to deflect any blame. But Mary wasn't about to let him manipulate the situation any longer. She stood up, her presence commanding attention. She had spent decades silently working in the shadows of Westwood, but now she was stepping into the light to defend the truth. She calmly walked to the front of the room, a thick folder in her hands. As she placed the folder on a table, the room fell silent. "I believe I have important evidence the board needs to review before making any decisions," Mary said, her voice firm yet steady. She pulled out her phone and played the first recording, Richard's cold, dismissive words echoing through the room. "Daniel, I'm really not surprised that someone like you doesn't understand anything. People like you are only good at sports, but hopeless when it comes to academics," Richard's voice rang out, causing a wave of shock to ripple through the room. Richard's face turned pale as the reality of what was happening sank in. He had expected to walk into the meeting and brush off any accusations, But now, his own words were being used against him. The room, which had once been filled with uncertainty, was now charged with a sense of conviction. The teachers, the staff, the administration, everyone knew the truth now. Mary didn't stop there. She played the second recording, where Richard had made disparaging remarks about her. His venomous words, intended to tear down her dignity, only revealed the true nature of the man sitting before them. Richard stood up, his anger beginning to boil over. "This is a misunderstanding. These recordings have been edited to tarnish my reputation," he shouted, trying to regain control of the situation. But it was too late. The truth had already been revealed. Principal Peterson, now completely serious, turned to Richard. "Mr. Calloway, do you have an explanation for this clear evidence?" he asked, his voice cold. Richard's arrogance had vanished. He could feel the walls closing in around him. He could no longer pretend that everything was fine. His usual smug demeanor had turned into desperation as he searched for an escape. But the truth was undeniable. The meeting ended with Richard's dismissal. The teachers and staff were left to process the shock of what had just transpired. Richard Calloway, once a teacher who thought his position gave him the right to belittle others, was now exposed for who he truly was.